"We can't have him living here anymore," my stepdad said after manipulating everyone. I was unstable. I left that night. A week later, they received eviction papers. I'm 19 years old, trying to figure things out like most people my age. The difference is, I've been the responsible one since I was just a kid. When my dad died, I was only 7. I didn't get the luxury of being just a child anymore. Mom, Sally is her name, she was all I had. For years, it was just the two of us against the world. We had this rhythm, you know? We weren't perfect, but we were a team. I still remember how she'd ruffle my hair and call me her little man, which I pretended to hate but secretly loved. Those memories feel like they belong to someone else's life now. Everything changed when Tom came into the picture. At first, Tom seemed all right. He was smooth, charming, and nice to me when I first met him. But after a while, I realized he wasn't who he pretended to be. He was manipulative, selfish, and I could see right through it. But my mom, she was all in. She convinced herself that she had to hold on to him because he was the only one who'd love her. The more time passed, the more I saw her ignore the things he did to control us. He was a master at triangulation. When I wasn't around, he'd apparently tell Mom how concerned he was about my attitude problem or how I seemed withdrawn. Then when Mom would bring these concerns up to me, I'd be completely blindsided. "What attitude problem?" I'd ask, genuinely confused. "I've barely even spoken to Tom this week." But the seed of doubt had already been planted in her mind. As time went on, Tom's tactics became more obvious to me, though still invisible to everyone else. He'd volunteer to pick me up from school, then conveniently forget until I'd been waiting for an hour. When I'd finally get home, frustrated and tired, he'd be there with Mom, explaining how I must have mixed up the times. "Chris has been so forgetful lately," he'd say with that concerned look. "Maybe we should get him checked for ADHD?" And Mom would look at me with this mixture of worry and disappointment that made my stomach knot up. The worst part was watching how he manipulated my mom. Sally had always been strong in her own quiet way. After Dad died, she held everything together even when she was falling apart inside. But Tom knew exactly how to target her insecurities. He'd praise her for the smallest things. "You're such an amazing cook, Sally. I've never met a woman who could make hamburger helper taste gourmet," making her dependent on his approval. Then he'd withdraw that praise randomly, leaving her scrambling to figure out what she'd done wrong. "You know I love you, Sally," he'd say when she questioned him about anything, "but sometimes you're just too sensitive. That's not what I meant at all." Classic gaslighting. I'd seen it enough times to recognize it, but Mom was too deep in his web to see what was happening. Then came Lindsay, Tom's daughter from a previous relationship. She moved in with us about a year after Tom and Mom got married. At 16, she was everything I wasn't: loud, demanding, and completely entitled. She'd throw tantrums over the slightest inconvenience, yet Tom would treat her like she was a delicate princess who needed protecting. The way Tom turned everyone against me was methodical. He started with my mom, then Lindsay, then extended family and neighbors. He'd tell slightly different versions of stories to different people, creating this patchwork narrative where I was increasingly painted as troubled and ungrateful. To our neighbor, I was a troublemaker who stayed out too late. To my mom's sister, I was going through a phase and giving my poor mother grief. By the time I was 18, I felt like I was living in some twisted alternate reality. The story everyone believed about me had nothing to do with who I actually was. I was still taking honors classes, working part-time at the local grocery store, and had never even gotten a detention. But somehow, in Tom's narrative, I was this disruptive, potentially dangerous presence in the house. The breaking point came on a Thursday night. We were having dinner, one of Tom's mandatory family dinners, where he'd interrogate me about my day while barely letting me get a word in. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Then Lindsay, with this calculated little smirk, dropped her bomb. "Dad," she said sweetly, "Chris made me feel really uncomfortable earlier." I nearly choked on my water. Earlier that day, Lindsay had cornered me in the kitchen when everyone else was out. She'd pressed herself against me, whispering something about how we're not really related, and how it wouldn't be that weird if something happened between us. It was disgusting and creepy. I'd pushed her away, not roughly, just enough to create space, and told her firmly to back off. She'd stormed away, slamming doors like she always did when she didn't get her way. But now, sitting at dinner, she was twisting it completely. The way she told it, I'd been the one making inappropriate suggestions. I was trapped in her lie, and from the look in Tom's eyes, I knew he'd been waiting for something exactly like this. "Listen," Tom said, turning to my mom with practiced concern. "He's 18 now, he's a burden, we can't have him living here anymore." "I don't know," Mom said, her voice weak. "Maybe it's time." Those words hit me like a physical blow. My own mother, the woman I'd helped through her darkest days after Dad died, was actually considering throwing me out based on a blatant lie. She wouldn't even look me in the eye. I stood up, my legs shaking. "Seriously, you're really just gonna let him do this?" I asked her. The silence that followed told me everything I needed to know. She had made her choice, and it wasn't me. That night, I packed my things, just 2 suitcases of clothes, my laptop, and the few remaining photos I had of Dad that Tom hadn't managed to lose. I didn't have a plan, just the desperate need to get out of that toxic environment before I completely lost myself in Tom's twisted reality. I called Uncle Jack, my dad's brother. We weren't super close. Tom had made sure of that by telling Mom that Jack was a bad influence who enabled my attitude problems, but he was the only person I could think of who might understand. He picked me up without hesitation, not even asking for details until we were safely at his apartment. But even after I'd physically escaped, Tom's manipulation continued. Within days, he was spreading stories throughout the neighborhood. To some, he claimed I'd stolen money from them. To others, he hinted that I had violent tendencies. He even contacted my workplace, expressing concerns to my manager about my reliability, nearly costing me my job. It was like he couldn't stand the idea that I'd escaped his control, so he was determined to destroy whatever independent life I might build. He contacted distant relatives, old family friends, even my high school counselor, spinning different versions of the same lie that I was troubled, potentially dangerous, and had abandoned my poor mother who had done everything for me. Some people believed him without question. My neighbor, who used to give me cookies when I was little, now crossed the street to avoid me. My friend's parents suddenly didn't want him hanging out with me. Even my mom's parents, my own grandparents, sent me a stiffly worded email about respecting my mother and giving Tom a chance. Update 1. There were days when I didn't know who I was anymore. Was I really the problem? Was I truly this violent, ungrateful, selfish kid that he'd convinced everyone I was? No matter how many times I told myself it wasn't true, his words still found their way inside my head, taking root like some invasive weed that refused to die. Then came the phone call that changed everything. I was at work, stacking produce in the organic section of the grocery store, when my phone vibrated in my pocket. Uncle Jack rarely called during my shifts, so I knew something was up. I quickly stepped into the back room to answer. "Chris, you need to come home as soon as your shift ends," he said, his voice unusually tense. "There's something you need to see." I spent the rest of my shift distracted, nearly knocking over a display of cantaloupes as my mind raced through possibilities. Had something happened to Mom? Had Tom escalated his smear campaign against me? By the time I pulled into Uncle Jack's driveway, my stomach was in knots. Jack was waiting for me at the kitchen table, an old leather folder spread open in front of him. He looked up when I walked in, and there was something in his expression I couldn't quite read, a mixture of anger, disbelief, and what almost looked like triumph. "Sit down, kid," he said, pushing the folder toward me. "I've been cleaning out some of my old files, and I found something that should have been given to you a long time ago." I sat, pulling the worn folder closer. Inside was a stack of legal documents, the kind with official seals and signatures at the bottom. The paper felt heavy in my hands as I started to read, the legal jargon swimming before my eyes until I caught a familiar address, our home address, followed by my name. "What is this?" I asked, though part of me already knew, a slow realization dawning as I scanned the document. "Your father's will," Jack said, his voice softer now. "Your dad left the house to you, Chris, not to Sally, not to be shared to you directly. He set it up in a trust that you'd gain control of when you turned 18. I was supposed to be the executor, but after your dad died." He trailed off, running a hand over his face. "Sally was so broken, I couldn't bring myself to push the issue then, and as time passed, I assumed she knew, that she was holding it for you until you were of age." I stared at the document, my father's signature at the bottom, suddenly the only thing in focus. "The house that my mom and Tom are living in. It's mine all this time." Jack nodded grimly. "Legally, yes. Since your 18th birthday 4 months ago, that house has belonged to you. Not Tom, not your mom, you." I felt lightheaded, like I might pass out or throw up or both. I wasn't just some kid being pushed out of their home. I was the rightful owner being manipulated and forced out of my own property. All those renovations Tom had made, all the ways he'd erased my dad's presence, he'd been doing to a house that wasn't even his. "Does Mom know?" I finally managed to ask, though I think I already knew the answer. Jack's expression darkened. "She has to. Her name is on these documents, too. She signed as a witness. And I mentioned it to her once years ago before Tom came into the picture. She brushed it off, said we'd figure it out when the time came." That night I couldn't sleep. I kept picturing Tom strutting around my father's house, my house, acting like he owned the place, throwing away my dad's things, cutting down our tree, making my mother believe I was the intruder when all along he was the one who didn't belong. By morning, a strange calm had replaced my anger. For months, I'd felt powerless watching Tom systematically dismantle my life. But now I had leverage, I had the truth, and I had the law on my side. I spoke with Jack over breakfast, laying out what I wanted to do. He listened without interrupting, then nodded slowly when I finished. "It won't be easy," he warned. "Tom won't go quietly, and your mom. This could be the final break between you two. Are you prepared for that?" I thought about all the times Mom had stood by silently while Tom belittled me, all the times she'd chosen his version of events over mine. The way she'd hesitated at the dinner table when Lindsay lied about me, like she was actually considering whether her own son was some kind of predator. How she'd let Tom erase every trace of my father from our home without protest. "Yes," I said finally. "I'm prepared." That afternoon, I met with a lawyer Jack recommended. He reviewed the documents, his expression growing increasingly grim as he flipped through the pages. "This is straightforward," he said when he finished. "The house is yours, no question. Your mother has been living there essentially as a tenant since you turned 18, though I'm sure she didn't see it that way. We can file for eviction immediately." "And Tom?" I asked. He smiled, though there was no humor in it. "Your stepdad has no legal standing whatsoever. He's not on the deed, not on the will, not on anything. Legally speaking, he's a guest who's overstayed his welcome." We spent the next hour going over my options. I could demand immediate eviction, giving them the minimum legal notice required, just 3 days in our state. I could offer a longer timeline as a courtesy. I could even negotiate some kind of rental agreement if I wanted to maintain ownership, but allow them to stay. That night, I sent my mom a text. It was simple, direct. "You have 1 week to leave the house. I know the truth about Dad's will." My heart pounded so hard as I hit send that I could feel it in my fingertips. I didn't know what was going to happen next, but I knew it couldn't be worse than what I had already lived through. Update 2. I waited for the explosion. It came almost immediately, first a call that I let go to voicemail, then a barrage of texts from Mom that oscillated between confusion, denial, and guilt-tripping. "What are you talking about?" the first one read. "This isn't funny, Chris. Please call me back. We need to talk about this. You can't just throw your family out on the street. After everything I've done for you, this is how you repay me." I didn't respond to any of them. I couldn't. I knew if I heard her voice, if I engaged in any kind of back and forth, I might weaken, might start to doubt myself again. So I silenced my phone and tried to focus on my homework, though the words on the page seemed to blur together. Then came a text from an unknown number, Tom. "You ungrateful little shit. Your mother is in tears. Is that what you wanted? To hurt her more than you already have?" That one I almost responded to, my thumbs hovering over the keyboard as I composed and deleted a dozen different replies. In the end, I just blocked the number. This wasn't about hurting Mom. It was about reclaiming what was mine, what Dad had intended for me to have. The next morning, as I was leaving for class, I found Lindsay waiting by my car. She looked smaller somehow, less confident without Tom and Mom backing her up. "You can't do this," she said, her voice lacking its usual edge. "Where are we supposed to go?" I felt a twinge of guilt. Lindsay, for all her faults, was still just a kid caught in the middle of adult problems. But then I remembered how she'd lied about me, how she'd been a willing participant in Tom's campaign to drive me out. "That's not my problem," I said, moving past her to unlock my car. "You have a week. I suggest you start packing." She followed me, grabbing my arm. "What if I told everyone the truth, that I lied that night at dinner? Would you let us stay then?" I stared at her, momentarily stunned by the admission. Part of me wanted to say yes, to use this as leverage to clear my name. But another part knew it wouldn't change anything. Tom would just find another way to twist the narrative to make me the villain. "It's too late for that," I said finally, gently removing her hand from my arm. "The house is mine. It always was. That's the only truth that matters now." As I drove away, I caught sight of her in my rearview mirror, standing alone in the street. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Then I remembered the look on her face that night at dinner, the calculated malice in her eyes as she told her lie, and any sympathy I might have felt evaporated. A week passed by both excruciatingly slowly and in a blur. I immersed myself in work and school, trying not to think about what was happening at the house, my house. I'd given the eviction notice to my lawyer, who served it officially. Mom had called Jack hysterical, but he'd stood firm, telling her that this was between her and me. The day of the eviction, I couldn't concentrate on anything. I kept checking my phone, half expecting another barrage of texts from Mom. But there was nothing. The silence was almost worse than the anger had been. It was my lawyer who called me later that afternoon. "They're gone," he said simply. "The locksmith is changing the locks now. Do you want to come see the property?" The property, my home, reduced to a legal term. I drove there in a daze, not sure what I'd find. Would they have trashed the place out of spite? Would Mom have taken everything, leaving me with an empty shell? As I pulled into the driveway, I was struck by how ordinary the house looked from the outside. The same faded blue paint, the same slightly overgrown hedges. If I squinted, I could almost pretend it was still the house from my childhood, before Tom, before everything fell apart. Michael met me at the front door, handing me a set of keys. "All yours," he said. "They took their personal belongings but left the furniture, standard in these situations." I nodded numbly, taking the keys. They felt heavy in my palm, the weight of victory and loss combined. The emotional aftermath was brutal. Even though I had reclaimed my house, even though I had forced Tom out, it didn't feel like a victory. My mother's letter haunted me. I kept taking it out, reading it, wondering if there was any way back from this precipice we'd found ourselves on. Could I forgive her? Should I? I still couldn't get my mom to see that I wasn't the villain in this story. She might recognize her own failures now, might even acknowledge Tom's manipulation, but part of her still believed his lies about me. That I was selfish, ungrateful, the son who had thrown his own mother out onto the street. It hurt more than I thought it would. In my darkest moments, I'd catch myself thinking, maybe if I had done something different. But then I'd remember the truth. This wasn't my fault. This was about Tom manipulating her, turning her against me, and me finally standing up for myself, reclaiming what was mine, what my father had wanted me to have. I spent the next few weeks slowly making the house mine again. I repainted my bedroom, hung up posters, bought new furniture that reflected my taste, not Tom's. I even planted a new maple tree in the backyard, in the same spot where the one my dad and I had planted once stood. As for Tom, he didn't go quietly. He tried to contest the eviction, claiming he'd made improvements to the property that increased its value. His lawyer sent threatening letters, demanding compensation. Michael handled it all with calm efficiency, dismissing each claim as the desperate grasping it was. "He has no legal ground to stand on," my lawyer assured me. "He knew he had no right to that property. The fact that he's fighting it just shows how entitled he feels to what isn't his." Eventually, the threats subsided. Tom and Lindsay moved to another state. I heard from a former classmate that he'd found a new job, a new start. Part of me wondered if he'd find another single mother to manipulate, another family to destroy. But that wasn't my problem anymore. As for Mom, we're not back to where we were. I'm not sure we ever will be. But she calls sometimes, and I've started answering. We talk about neutral topics: the weather, my classes, her new job at a different hospital. We carefully avoid discussing Tom or the house or the painful past. It's a fragile truce, but it's something. I don't know what the future holds. Some days the house still feels too empty, too full of ghosts. Other days I feel a quiet pride in having reclaimed what's mine, in having stood up to the man who tried to erase me from my own life. What I do know is this: I'm not the person Tom tried to make me believe I was. I'm stronger than I thought, more resilient than I gave myself credit for. And maybe, just maybe, my dad knew that all along. Maybe that's why he left me the house, not just as a place to live, but as a reminder that I have the right to stand my ground, to fight for what's mine, to build a life that's truly my own.